Hi, I'm Ant and welcome to part 5 of our series of House Church. Today I'm going to talk about money and giving. Now of course this will not be something that everybody will agree with me on, I understand that, but here goes. You might recall that in part 2 of the series we talked about the traditional incorporated church structure. So it's like a triangle or a pyramid, and most of the money that is given or other services are swallowed up by the organisation. So you've got wages, superannuation, insurance, you've got the building costs, the incorporation costs, and your running costs, whatever they may be. So that swallows up the bulk of what you give, and all you have left is a little bit at the top for things like missions or giving to the poor or other outreach programs. Even worse, if people stop giving or the giving goes down, you've got even less to give. So this system here is not very effective. Well, the obvious question you're probably asking is, how does it work in a house church? Do you have an incorporation? Well, the answer is no, we don't. There is no incorporation. I'm not paying a pastor's wage, so I'm like a Paul. I go and work a normal job, and then we have house church, and there's no wages. There's no of those other costs, your insurance, your building, and all of those other sorts of things. So what do you do with the money? Well, the answer is we don't handle the money, as simple as that. That's why we're not an incorporation. So for example, I might get a wage, a salary, whatever it is that I earn, and I might determine to give to the Lord, whatever that amount is. So the key things that I want to give into are things that are going to cause outreach and giving to the poor. So I'm not focused on giving into people who want to be paid wages and all those other costs. So let's say, for example, I decide to give to the poor. Well, I found a ministry locally here in town. It is an incorporation. Most charities are an incorporation. However, the board does not receive a wage. They're all volunteers. They're all business people. So that money that I put into giving into the poor and feeding them locally on the street, most of that goes directly where it should go, into feeding the poor. And likewise with missions. The whole idea of giving into missions is you're doing outreach. So I believe that what God wants us to do to give into his kingdom is he wants us to give into outreach that's going to spread the gospel, and he wants to feed the poor. This is a great emphasis in the Bible. Let's read from Acts chapter 18 verses 1 to 3. Paul says this, "After these things Paul departed from Athens and went to Corinth. And he found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded that all the Jews depart from Rome, and he came to them. So because he is of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for by occupation they were tent makers." Well, tent makers could be building tents, or there is also an inference it could be somebody who sews seams, somebody like a tailor or something like that. But Paul had a trade, so whilst he was out there ministering, going house to house, he worked his trade and supported himself, and then he went and ministered the gospel. So in Acts chapter 16, verses 14 through to 15, it says this, "Now a certain woman named Lydia heard us. She was a seller of purple from the city of Thyatira, who worshipped God. The Lord opened her heart to heed the things spoken by Paul. And when she and her household were baptized, she begged us, saying, 'If you have judged me to be faithful to the Lord, come to my house and stay.' So she persuaded us." So Paul came, he ministered to Lydia. She was a seller of purple, which is fabric, obviously another business person, a wealthy person, and she persuaded him to stay in his house. So again, the ministry is from house to house, but Paul didn't have to pay for everything himself. There were times that people opened up their hearts in their homes and they ministered to him, so they gave him lodging and looked after him. So Paul was working his job, he was earning money, but also other people were moved by the Lord to give him lodging and help him out. And this is how missionaries work. That's what an apostle is. An apostle is a sent one going from house to house. In Galatians chapter 2 verses 9 and 10 it says this, And when James, Cephas, and John, who seemed to be pillars, perceived the grace that had been given to me, they gave me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship, that we should go to the Gentiles and they to the circumcised. They desired only that we should remember the poor, the very thing which I was also eager to do. Well, isn't that interesting? Today in many churches, they're all talking about being rich, wealthy, and doing well. But what was the thing that the early apostles and Paul were keen to do? They were keen to look after the poor. So you might think this is only a menial thing, but consider this. In Proverbs chapter 28, verse 27, it says this, "He who gives to the poor will not lack, but he who hides his eye will have many curses." So there you go. From God's point of view, he who gives the poor does not lack. As a matter of fact, it even says that he who gives to the poor is like lending to the Lord. So God has a blessing for those who give to the poor. Oh, and a little tip, don't let anybody know you're doing it. Jesus himself said many times, when you give, give in secret. Don't do it out openly so that everybody knows about it. So in James chapter 2, verses 14 to 16, it says this, "What does it profit, my brethren, if someone says he has faith but does not have works? Can faith save him? If a brother or sister is naked and destitute of daily food, and one of you says to them, 'Depart in peace, be warmed and filled,' but do not give them the things which are needed for the body, what does it profit?" And so what James is saying here is if your faith is going to be real faith, it's got to be practical. You have to help your brother and sister in need. Now, I remember a few years ago we were involved in a large church and we found out that there was a single lady with 2 children, and the situation was it's cold where we live and her heater had broken down in her rental, and the real estate agent was dragging their feet to get this thing fixed. So they were freezing in this house. And we found out that the church was doing nothing for them, wasn't interested. But we did have a spare heater, so we got that heater, set it up for her in a main living area, and at least they kept warm. Now, this is a real illustration of where a lot of the big churches are failing. It's all about giving into their ministry and doing all these things. But then there are people in their congregations who are going cold and hungry. Now that should not be. James is saying here that we should be practical people. And in a house church, instead of giving all your money and wasting it on these organisations, what we do is we focus more on the people and give out to the people. And that's what really counts. In Hebrews 7 verses 1 to 2 it says this, "For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him, to whom also Abraham gave a 10th part of all, first being translated King of Righteousness, and then also King of Salem, meaning King of Peace." So what about tithing? Now I knew that this would be something that people would be interested in. Well, Abraham, before the law, actually gave a 10th part of his spoil to the king of Salem, Melchizedek. And Melchizedek is a type of Christ. So yes, there is a place for giving into the Lord and into the ministry. But here's something to think about. Why stop at 10%? Who said it had to be that figure? You could give more. Now, a tenth was given as an offering to God, but we have to remember that in the Old Testament, under the law, it was a different system. They did not have a king. This is before the kings, and they instituted tithing in the book of Leviticus and those other books. But there was more than one tithe. Many ministers won't tell you this. There were tithes for lots of different things, and some of the tithes were even for the people to enjoy. They don't often teach about that either. And there were other years that they were supposed to rest, which they did not tithe in. Does your pastor tell you about that? Probably not. But basically, today in our system, we have governments running things. Now, they do have a welfare system. They did not have that back then. So a lot of the people gave into the different things that the Bible ordered so that the poor would be fed and that the welfare would be met for the people. But today, I'm not saying governments are good spenders of money, but they basically have a welfare system. A lot of your taxes that you're paying are already going into those things. So don't think that you have to be stuck with the whole tithing idea. Now, anything above a tithe, a 10th, is an offering. So you can give offerings too, and God does love a cheerful giver, for sure. So giving into the Lord is not necessarily giving into these big ministries. Giving to the poor is giving to the Lord. It's like you're lending to him. Giving into missions, which spreads out his word, which is what the early church did, is giving into the Lord. So all of these types of things actually bless God. So don't get stuck in the idea of tithing in the traditional sense. It doesn't necessarily work that way. And there's many things that we're doing today that is very different to what they were doing back in those days. Our society works very different. So for us, when we give, we're not giving into our local fellowship. No, I'm looking for charities. I'm looking for giving to the poor. I'm looking for missions. I'm looking for ways of helping people around me. Now, you can set up a bank account and put aside some money. And what happens if somebody has a need? Well, the money's there, and that's giving to the Lord. Giving into a cup of water or anything else, or putting something warm on somebody, is just as much giving to the Lord as what anything else is. So don't be subdued or condemned by feeling that if you're not giving into a big church, that you're not honouring the Lord. That's just simply not true. You can give freely as the Holy Spirit guides you. You can give into his ministry, and it's much, much broader than what a lot of people will tell you. And don't feel bad that you're not supporting somebody getting their bigger aeroplane either. You're actually doing more good feeding people that are hungry. So that's my thoughts about money. There's no need for an incorporation in a house church. You're not giving into a business. So there we go. Well, we'll stop there. God bless you, and bye for now.